Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. I'm Randy Wright, and I'll be your captain on this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. Folks, this will be the final boarding call, so if you please, claim your seats, fasten your seatbelts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show while I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, as there really is a lot of news and information to get to before I may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, yesterday we witnessed two horrific attacks on the United States of America, and it happened in the bordering states of New York and New Jersey. Fortunately, the attack that occurred in New Jersey did not result in any fatalities or any reported injuries, but it was kind of striking that we found that it was in a dumpster. It was essentially a pipe bomb type device or an improvised explosive device that was detonated within a trash can within the county of Oceantown there in New Jersey. And basically what it was related to was targeting this Marine Corps charity marathon event that was taking place in that little ocean town in New Jersey. And what's so disgusting about it is it conjures up all of these memories of the Chattanooga, Tennessee Marine Corps Recruiting Center shooting that occurred last year, the San Bernardino terrorist attack, and all of these various other terrorist attacks that are related to the Islamo-fascist who are just hell-bent on the complete and utter annihilation, not only of the United States of America, but indeed our entire Western culture and philosophy. This is because it's a medieval, barbaric ideology that truly is twisted and diabolical. Yet we see that the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists do not want to go out and properly identify who these enemies of the United States really are. Why? Because they are mired in the twin cancerous doctrines of political correctness and moral relativism. Yet we see that that plays out to our great detriment in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. And it is not something that plays out well, because it really does hamper us. It emboldens our enemies because, let's face it, folks, these people have declared war on the United States, and this goes all the way back to the first World Trade Center bombing that occurred in 1993, and of course was followed up by the most vicious, savage, and bloody terrorist attack ever orchestrated in United States history on September 11th of 2001. And it's hard to believe that we are just this far out, what is it, about 7 days after the 15th anniversary of the 9/11 terror attacks. And it would certainly seem to fit into the lone wolf style mentality that has been surrounding the ISIS or Islamo-fascist state, who has sworn to everyone that their entire impetus and purpose, as well as goal, is to create a global caliphate, to plunge the entire world into their barbaric, twisted, medieval practices and belief system. And of course, that really is something that should give pause to every decent, hard-working, red-blooded American citizen, because these people are the ones who want to destroy us. They seek to destroy us simply because we do not adhere to their dark, twisted cult of death. And there really is no way around that, folks. There's no way to sugarcoat that or to candy coat that. That is what we're facing. But at this stage, the authorities are very reluctant to try and proclaim that it's terrorism. They are afraid to conjure that up because it might spell panic or create pandemonium within the public at large in the United States. And so they are being exceedingly cautious, and I can't blame them for that. But what I do have a problem with is this inability to connect the dots, this willingness on the part of the disastrous Barack Hussein Obama regime to try and delve into moral relativism as though to say that the Islamo-fascists are not enemies, that it is just something that we brought on to ourselves, or that it was somehow brought about by something as ridiculous as the hoax of man-made global warming. Because if you recall, one of the things that Vermont Senator and former presidential candidate Wright Sanders had said during the primary process was that essentially terrorism, or Islamo-fascist terrorism, was caused by, that's right, climate change. That's literally what he went out and said. And it was during one of the debates that he said this. And folks, it's just so staggering to hear it. But I think that it is so on point that it bears repeating again. So I've actually got the soundbite of him doing that, or saying that. And so I'm going to cue that up right now just to help refresh our memory with respect to what it was that Nerdface Boing Me Sanders had said. So here we go. Let me cue that up right now.
Said the greatest threat to national security was climate change. Do you still believe that?
Absolutely. In fact, climate change is directly related to the growth of terrorism. And if we do not get our act together and listen to what the scientists say, you're going to see countries all over the world. This is what the CIA says. They're going to be struggling over limited amounts of water, limited amounts of land to grow their crops. And you're going to see all kinds of international conflict. But of course, international terrorism is a major issue that we have got to address today.
I'm sorry, Bernie, but when you have al-Baghdadi, who's one of the head guys there at the Islamo-fascist state, saying that their entire purpose is to create just that, an Islamic state, I'm not going to buy into this nonsense that it's somehow created or caused by global warming. That just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. That seems to be something that you pulled out of your posterior. But it does speak to something that is a deeper problem. It speaks to the fact that we have allowed these twin cancerous doctrines of political correctness and moral relativism to become so deeply rooted in the societal fabric of the United States that our leaders are literally afraid to call our enemies who they are. Now, our enemies have no qualms about declaring war on us. They say death to America. We see that with not just the Islamo-fascist state, but with some of our traditional enemies, such as Iran. Yet Barack Hussein Obama is continuing to adhere to this disastrous Iranian nuclear deal, which was done kind of in the smoke-filled dark back rooms and really was not carried out with the best interests of the United States of America and her people at heart. And that's part of the problem that we face with these frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists. It's that they engage in these counterintuitive sorts of schemes and plots in order to further weaken the United States, to distance ourselves from our traditional allies and to strengthen our foes. And recall that a lot of the problems that we're facing now, at least with the Islamo-fascist terrorist organizations, is rooted in Obama's leading from his behind during the so-called Arab Spring that occurred in 2011. That was one of the things where the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftist agenda came to the forefront and literally weakened the United States. In fact, it brought about the terror attack that occurred against the American consulate in Benghazi, Libya, and resulted in the death of Ambassador Chris Stevens, who happened to be the first American ambassador to die overseas since 1979. And if that year sounds familiar, that was when the Iranian hostage crisis was happening under the tutelage of then President Jimmy Carter. Well, you see that there are these connections with respect to the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists and these just weak foreign policy positions, these positions that ultimately leave the United States and her foreign policy interests totally unstable. The instability that is brought about by this weak and feckless so-called leadership is unfathomable. But more than that, it's unacceptable. And while we aren't entirely certain that these attacks that occurred in New Jersey, which thankfully did not result in any injuries, or the more significant two-stage or two-area attack or improvised explosive device that went off in a Chelsea neighborhood in Manhattan, which did result in, as of last report, 29 injuries, one which is in serious condition. We don't know whether that is Islamo-fascist related, but the fact is the incidents have been claimed by the authorities not to be interrelated at all. Yet there are striking similarities that just caught my attention, such as the one that was in Ocean County, New Jersey, was 3 pipe-type bombs or pipe bomb-type improvised explosive devices that were left in a trash can receptacle, and only one of which detonated. And then the ones that were in New York were also left in a trash bin sort of receptacle. But again, it was, in that case, one of those pressure cooker bombs, which conjures up the images of the Boston Marathon bombing that occurred back in 2013, I believe it was. And that was just something that we need to keep in mind, that there are these circumstantial pieces of evidence which I think point to a type of terrorism. And it's very clear that the authorities, at least in Ocean County, New Jersey, believe that this was directly targeting the Semper Fi race or marathon, which was a marathon for charity being hosted by the United States Marine Corps. And again, when we think back to the Chattanooga, Tennessee terrorist shooting of the Marine Corps Recruiting Center last summer, it just brings these chilling connections back to the forefront. It demonstrates that we still have a lack of security in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic and vibrant community of popular sovereigns of ours. I wish that weren't the case, but again, it leaves us to question how the 2016 presidential election cycle is going to center around this and how that is going to be dealt with, because it will certainly bring the issue of terrorism back to the forefront. We've already seen that that was the case after the bloody gay nightclub shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida, some months back. That was an Islamo-fascist inspired attack, but the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists and their allies and the rank and file of the graduates of Pavlov's School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media did everything in their power to delve into moral relativism and political correctness to try and say that Islam had nothing to do with it. Again, why do we do this? Why do we go out and try to commit national suicide instead of admitting that we have a problem? There were commentators on the Quaff News Network last night who were trying to say that we just have to accept the fact that this is a war on terror. But imagine, if you will, going back some 70 years ago to the dark and twisted days of World War II. If we had called that the war on Blitzkrieg, I don't think we would have done as well, because certainly the Japanese were not ones that utilized blitzkrieg, and blitzkrieg wasn't always utilized by the Germans. Nevertheless, it's that sort of mindset, this idea of refusing to call the enemy for who the enemy is, that leads us to a confusing path of disarray, a path that is not in the best interests of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, we the people. Again, it's the sort of thing that they want to try and blame the United States, or to blame some ridiculous notion as climate change, as I just showed there with that soundbite from Vermont Senator Noidface. Blame me, Sandor, as the flying saucer. I love sauce as long as somebody else is paying for it, especially Thunderboy Liquor and Mad Dog 2020, I tell you what. You know, that sort of thing just does not make sense. It goes contrary to the great weight of the evidence. It goes against the direct things that they are saying. But I think it's also important that we hear what the spokesperson for the bomb in New Jersey had to say, and his name is Al. What's the rest of his name? I'm sorry, folks. I'm looking at that right now. This is on CNN, but it's Al Della Fave. What an interesting name, Al Della Fave. He's the one that came out and proclaimed that they thought this was directly targeting the Seaside Semper Fi run. And so I'm going to go ahead and cue up that soundbite just so we have a chance to hear what he said, and then we'll delve in a little more deeply to it. So here we go. Get that queued up now.
We've evacuated a 4-block area around that perimeter to make sure that no issues to any individuals that live within that area.
You said multiple devices wired together.
Right.
How many devices are we talking about here?
I've been told anywhere from 2 to 3 additional pipe bomb type devices that were wired together to the initial explosion that went off. Again, that won't be specifically able to say until the investigation continues.
Are investigators treating this as a remote or a timed detonation of this device to coincide with the runners that were supposed to be running past the Marines, their families, their friends, running past that area when it went off?
Yeah, what the intentions are of the individual, we don't know at this point, whether it's criminal or terroristic. I mean, it's obvious it was meant to affect the run. The fact that it went off at 9:35.
Any other devices found along the route or just inside that trash bin?
Right after the incident took place, immediately put the area on lockdown. They brought in bomb dogs from surrounding areas. Those bomb dogs have completed their sweep. There's no additional devices found. Actually, in Seaside Heights, they're continuing their barbecue fest that's going on without a hitch. But in this area, until the bomb squad gives us the all clear in terms of that garbage pail, we're going to keep things kind of closed off.
You know, folks, that really does conjure up memories of the Boston Marathon bombing. You see, it was another run that was occurring in the Northeast that is being targeted to basically maximize on the fear factor. That's what these terrorists love to do. That's what they engage in. They want to spread fear and terror within the hearts, souls, and minds of we the people. The reason being is then they realize that their twisted machinations will at least get some form or modicum of attention. In their mind, that is the only way that they know how to truly get themselves heard. But it is the strategy and tactics of cowards. There really is no other way to refer to it other than as the tactic and strategy of sheer, unadulterated cowards. The reason I say that it's cowardly is because it's done to just be wicked. There's an evil to this that is not known in any other type of tactic or strategy used by a political force. And yes, the Islamo-fascist terrorists who have been encouraging these sorts of lone wolf attacks that we've seen, such as the San Bernardino terrorist shooting of late last year and the Pulse Gay nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida a few months back, They propagate that to help spread this fear, because it's not organized. It's sort of like a splinter cell, or what you might call a sleeper cell, that just means that they could be anywhere in and around us. And one of the things that the terrorists have always sought to do is to utilize our fundamental and inalienable God-given rights against us. In a sense, what they want to do is try to use the Constitution in order to destroy the Constitution. And that sort of mindset is truly dangerous. It's the same type of fanaticism that we saw exhibited by Japanese soldiers during the Second World War, with their suicidal banzai charges and the kamikaze pilots who attempted to take out American war vessels or warships and the American fleet by these suicide attacks. But what makes the Islamo-fascist barbarian terrorists even worse than the Japanese soldiers during the dark and twisted days of World War II is the fact that they are purposefully, intentionally targeting American civilians. They do not wear a recognized uniform. They try to intersperse it within society at large, and thereby gain greater access to pick soft targets in order to spread as much terror as possible. And you notice that's what they do. That's what happened with the Pulse Gay nightclub. That's what happened at San Bernardino. These people are not looking for significant military targets. They're not looking to go after people who have the ability to fight back. They're going to go out of their way to try and find gun-free zones, or these other government safety zones, for lack of a better term, that ultimately provides them with soft and easy targets where they know no one will basically pose a threat to them or attempt to stand up to them or attempt to ultimately defend themselves against these dark and twisted machinations. You see, that's the sort of thing that is cowardly. Unfortunately, when we play around with these games of semantics and playing the two or twin cancerous doctrines of political correctness and moral relativism, we expose ourselves to further emboldening these terrorists to try and strike again, because deep down in their heart of hearts, they fully realize that they have struck a chord with the American people, and not a good chord, the sort of chord that does spread anarchy, chaos, death, depravity, degradation, and depression. We should never bow down to these people. We should never capitulate to their demands. We should never even negotiate with them. But one of the things we've noticed is that Barack Hussein Obama, in these waning days of his disastrous regime, has been proactively engaging with negotiations with terrorists. Recall what he did with Bo Bergdahl. He essentially gave away some of the top Taliban fighters that we had in custody at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, for a man who was essentially a deserter. And this was all done with negotiation. It was all done to placate the terrorists and to basically try and create this sort of public relations image that the Obama regime wanted to accomplish. However, it backfired on them, because this sort of thing came to light. His fellow servicemen came out and said that no, he really was going out and trying to desert. And then we find out that his parents have Islamic ties. And again, this is the sort of thing that we just can't ignore. It's part of that common thread that forms an undeniable pattern, except that the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists just don't want to admit it. They don't want to come forth and proclaim that there really is this sort of terrorist connection with at least a faction of the so-called Islamic faith. Now, I'm sure that not all Muslims engage in this sort of activity, but there is enough of a pattern that we've seen since the First World Trade Center bombing back in 1993 to really make us take a moment of pause and realize that the ones who have carried out the worst and most wholesale slaughter and bloodshed here in the United States of America are all tied or connected in some form or fashion to the so-called Islamic faith. But again, they try and go into the avenue of moral relativism with this, trying to say that, well, the Christians engaged in acts of terrorism during the Crusades, which happened nearly 1,000 years ago, folks. This is the sort of madness that we are facing. It's the sort of thing that directly places our national security in dire threat. And unfortunately, I don't see either one of the two candidates for the mainstay political parties who have a practicable and real world solution that will actually deal with the terrorists. With respect to Donald J. Trump, his reactions to our allies and his push to try and get us out of NATO or to have our NATO allies pay in violation of the direct terms of the treaty makes no sense. In fact, former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, who was first appointed by George W. Bush and served during the first term of the Obama regime, said that Trump is just not someone that we can trust. He's a loose cannon. He's dangerous. In fact, he says that both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are dangerous, but in his mind, Trump is far more dangerous than Hillary. That is not a ringing endorsement. That is not something that boosts my sense of confidence. And I'm sure it doesn't boost the sense of confidence of the vast majority of our cherished listening passengers and audience members. And it shouldn't, because what it shows is that experts in the field are looking at the two candidates for the mainstay political parties and are saying that they are woefully inadequate, woefully ill-prepared to handle this increasingly dangerous world in which we live. And of course, with the ascendancy of the Islamo-fascist, barbarian terrorist state, we know that they are trying to make it even more difficult to find these people, to apprehend these people, and to address this wave of terror that is being unleashed against the United States of America. I wish this weren't the case, but it is the case, and we have to face facts, and that means clearly seeing that there is a major problem here. But there are good friends of mine who have embraced the mantle of the mafioso quafioso, who are essentially saying that if you don't support Donald J. Trump, then you are supporting terrorism because you're allowing Hillary Clinton to get elected and that she would continue the failed policies of Barack Hussein Obama. Yes, maybe she would, but here's the thing. Donald J. Trump would weaken us overseas even greater than I think Hillary Clinton would, and that would expose us to facing more terrorist attacks at home. It's part of that isolationist strain that has been a part of the alt-right, which forms a significant portion of Trump's underground support. And it's all this sort of madness that relates back to the sort of thinking that we had leading up to World War II. Isolationism is really not a good policy to have, particularly when you consider the way that our markets are just linked across the globe. If we become isolationist, it means that we will wither on the vine and lose the ability to protect our own financial interests. But then at the same time, we have Trump trying to come out and claim that he's going to boost the military, increase the military size, but that means more expenditures. And at this point, the United States is at a fiscal or financial breaking point. I don't believe that we can take on much more. And we certainly need to rein in the out-of-control spending that has become a hallmark of modern governance by the federal government. But none of the candidates support that. None of the political parties seem to show any backbone with respect to that. We've seen that Benedict Arnold Paul Ryan, the current Speaker of the House, decided to cave on a Cromnibus bill, essentially giving Barack Hussein Obama everything that he had asked for back when, this coming just after he had tried to create a so-called balanced budget when he was running as the vice presidential nominee back in the 2012 presidential election cycle. These are the sorts of things that we can't ignore, and they show that there is this undeniable pattern there. And unless and until we begin to truly address this, we're going to continue to see these problems continue unabated, and they are going to worsen at any given moment. And again, we just can't afford that. We can't afford it because our nation is essentially at the breaking point now. It's at a point where if we don't begin to address these problems, then it will never be resolved. It will be something that will be handed down to the up-and-coming generations, and indeed those generations which have yet to be born, which is something we shouldn't do. That's irresponsible on our part. It's unfair on our part, and it shows that we have been negligent, for lack of a better term, with respect to the future generations of this nation. And that's just insufferable and intolerable, intolerable. We just can't accept it. So while we had just finished with the Oceantown, New Jersey incident, it's also the New York attack that we need to focus on. Apparently, that was a two-pronged attack that involved improvised explosive devices that were made out of basically pressure cookers that had a cell phone trigger to them, and it did actually injure 29 people. And at least as of last reporting, it's currently 8:28 a.m. here in Texas, one is in serious condition. Now, we still don't know what motivated these people, but we do know that the authorities at this point in time are saying that this attack was not connected in any way, shape, or form to the one that occurred in the Oceantown County there in New Jersey. But one of the things that I found kind of interesting was the way that Bill de Blasio went out and tried to say that this had no connections to terrorism, but it was an intentional act. I'm not sure how it could not be an act of terrorism, just seeing the location of where these explosive devices were. They were put in dumpsters in the hopes of getting a busy area of a Chelsea neighborhood there in Manhattan, which is the largest city in the United States of America. And of course, New York has been a consistent target of the terrorist types. And I would not be surprised if this has an Islamo-fascist connection. But I'm not going to just go out and jump on that instantly. I'm just going to point to the fact that the circumstantial evidence and the past sorts of attacks that have been carried out in this manner and fashion almost always wind up being related to Islamo-fascist terrorism. But one of the things I think we need to bring up is the actual soundbite of Bill de Blasio giving this little speech himself there in New York in the immediate aftermath of the attack. And of course, at this point, or in this juncture, things are still speculative. The investigation is still ongoing, but it does carry all of the hallmarks of what a terrorist attack would do. Recall that the Chechen brothers, the Tsarnaevs, back in 2013 at the Boston Marathon bombing, had utilized pressure cooker bombs, and I don't recall whether it used a cell phone trigger, but this one did. And that there were two locations that were targeted, just to me seems to indicate that this isn't some sort of random act of violence. There is some sort of orchestration that is behind all of this. We just don't know what it is yet. But what I'm going to do now is cue up the soundbite of Bill de Blasio and then we'll discuss that in greater detail. So here we go.
Tonight, New York City experienced a very serious incident. All elements of our first responders have been a part of the operation here, NYPD, FDNY, Office of Emergency Management, obviously our federal partners, FBI and others working with us. So all hands are on deck. Injuries are significant. You'll hear from Commissioner Nigro on the details of the injuries. But at this point, we can confirm that none of those injured are likely to die. We also want to be upfront saying that there is no evidence at this point of a terror connection to this incident. This is preliminary information. It's something we will be investigating very carefully, but there is no evidence at this point of a terror connection. I also want to affirm that based on what we know at this hour, there is no specific connection to the incident in New Jersey. It is, again, too early to say anything definitive on those questions, but there's no specific evidence of a connection at this point.
Now, I have to say that, yes, it's fair to show that kind of restraint, but to merely call it an incident, to not call it an attack, seems to be trying to couch it in politically correct terms, to try and once again not have people make the connection or connotation that they will. But again, seeing as this is an election year, I do think that it's important to recall that this will probably spark the terrorism debate, or at least bring it to the epicenter of the presidential debate again. Now, I know that I mentioned this in the previous segment, but I want to go a little bit deeper into some of the concerns that I have with respect to the two candidates for the mainstay political parties. With respect to Hillary Clinton, there's this sort of nonsensical approach that she took in the wake of the Benghazi terrorist attacks of September 11th of 2012, where she parroted the line of the Barack Hussein Obama regime that it was somehow interrelated to an anti-Islamic or anti-Muslim YouTube video. But of course, that's just not the case. It wasn't true. They knew at the time it wasn't true. And the fact that she went in front of the cameras of the media at the funeral of those brave Americans who lost their lives at the Benghazi consulate and tried to double down on this erroneous and specious claim that it was caused by an anti-Islamic video and some sort of protest had just spontaneously erupted there in Benghazi, shows that she is not being forthright with the American people, or at least she was not being forthright with the American people at that time. And that does raise significant and serious questions as to her fitness to be commander-in-chief. But of course, we see that the Benghazi investigations that were led by Trey the Doofus Gowdy didn't go anywhere, that he dropped the ball on that it was essentially a sham like the Fast and Furious investigations that had been carried out by Darrell Issa previously. And so, again, this is the sort of thing that sparks up the lack of trust that the American people have with respect to the system of government. Is there any reason that we wouldn't blame people, that we would blame, rather, people for having these negative feelings or this feeling of disenfranchisement with the entire American system of polity when those who should be in positions of power and authority and should be held accountable are allowed to go scot-free? That's the sort of thing that really does create some, nagging questions, some lingering doubt, some pangs of pain with respect to the way that the government is being conducted. But of course, the gutless opposition party, or GOP, bungled that. There's no way around that fact. And I think that's one of the reasons why former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates said that he didn't trust Hillary Clinton, that he thought she would be an inadequate commander-in-chief. And of course, he's right to bring that up. These sorts of questions need to be addressed, and the graduates of Pavlov School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media have been refusing or derelict in their duty, just refusing to carry out their role as the watchdog for the American people. Now, why do I place such impetus and emphasis on this? It's because, if you recall, the reason that we have the guarantee free press as codified in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution, it was that they are supposed to serve the role as the watchdog against corrupt government, to protect the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, we the people, from this sort of chicanery that has seemingly become a new norm in the American system of polity. And so reservation and concern are certainly things to be felt here, but it wouldn't be so bad, or at least the edge of it wouldn't seem so bad, if the nominee for the gutless opposition party were any better. The problem is that our nominee is that of Donald J. Trump, a man who does not go forth and provide policy specifics, a man who just seems to shoot at the mouth at any time without even giving a second thought to the words that he is spewing forth. And that's what Robert Gates took extreme issue with in regards to Trump. He does not believe that he's someone we can trust. He believes that he would alienate our allies and place the national security of the United States in dire jeopardy. Now, Gates is an expert in this. He served as the Secretary of Defense under George W. Bush and then continued in that capacity for the first disastrous term of the Barack Hussein Obama regime. I'm going to give a fair amount of credence and credibility to Gates as being a man who took over in a time of great crisis with respect to our foreign policy, as the war in Iraq was still going on and Afghanistan was still going on, and the power that was taking over with the Barack Hussein Obama regime was one which did not really want to see us secure victory. And that's when we also saw the Islamo-fascist barbarian state come into existence throughout that so-called Arab Spring. And so, again, all of that plays to the great detriment of the United States. And then when we see that in this juncture, a juncture in which it was our election cycle to win, we've dropped the ball by picking somebody who is just woefully inadequate and ill-equipped to handle these sorts of things. Donald J. Trump doesn't have any experience when it comes to foreign policy. And recall that one of the first kerfuffles that he encountered ever since he first officially threw his quaff into the ring back in July of 2015 was that he didn't know what the nuclear triad was. Now, I know that I've mentioned that before, but here's what the nuclear triad is. It's our three-pronged approach to nuclear defense. We have the air-based defense, which is our strategic nuclear bombers, such as the B-52. We have our land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles with a nuclear payload. And then we have our nuclear submarines, what is known in naval parlance as boomer subs, which can traverse the globe's oceans and launch their payload in near virtual stealth or near total stealth, making them perhaps the most effective branch of or limb of the nuclear triad. And so when we keep that in mind, and the fact that Trump is woefully ill-prepared for it, it should raise some concerns. Now, I can already hear the shrill and discordant and disharmonious voices of the Lion Branch Trumpidians screaming and shouting from their Trumpidian tabernacle, saying that he could easily learn those things. Well, here's the problem. Trump does not show any desire, at least as far as I can tell, of listening to people. And again, I turn back to some of the things that Robert Gates was saying in a CNN interview, in which he said that that was one of the major shortcomings of Trump, that he didn't show an interest in learning or taking advice from his advisors. So again, it shows that perhaps one of the greatest lies that he used to propel himself to the top of the crop of 16 candidates vying for the gutless opposition party nomination during the primary process was that he would always surround himself with the best people. But again, the facts on the ground show that that's not really the case either. Recall that he had connections with Russia. And there's some major thing happening in Russia right now where they are blaming the United States for engaging essentially in an act of terrorism, or at least that's how they are framing it, by saying that we're helping ISIS, in that 16 Syrian soldiers were killed by American airstrikes in the region. And yes, the Pentagon admitted that we had those airstrikes. But again, it's done in such a way as the Russians are able to utilize it for propagandistic value. They are seeing a gold mine here to try and attack the United States. And then there was some bizarre report of an Australian radio station going out and saying that they were giving their condolences to the Syrian troops that were murdered. What in the hell has happened? So that our allies just decide that it's okay to go forth and stab us in the back. Well, it's that power vacuum that's created due to lack of leadership at the head of this nation. And again, with Robert Gates' concern with respect to both Madam Clinton and Donald Julius Caesar Trumpolini, it's something that we should give pause to. It's something that should cause alarm in the hearts and souls of the American people. Because again, when you stop and consider it, under the totality of the circumstances, this is going to continue the status quo, the continued weakening of America's position. It's going to be due in no small part to the fact that we are facing financial strains that are just unsustainable and will really hamper us, but it will also be due to the failed policies of either one of the mainstay candidates for the two political parties. But with Trump, what's really dangerous is this loose cannon aspect of who he is and what he is. And it's frightening. It's frightening because we just don't know what he will say or what he will do. We don't know how he will react or how he will act under pressure, and that is something that we just cannot allow to have happen. And one of the things that he did is he just goes out and says that he's going to bomb the excrement out of the ISIS people to get their oil. Again, why is it that we are just looking to get their oil? Oil is not the major concern here. Our national security is the main concern here. But it shows that Trump is disconnected from reality, that he's living in this own little bubble of that harebrain of his, and that is dangerous. But I'm going to cue up this soundbite, and before I actually do that, let me take this opportunity to caution you that there is that vulgar language in it, but I'm going to go ahead and cue that up now so that we can hear what he was saying, and then we can go about addressing it. So here we go.
ISIS is making a tremendous amount of money because they have certain oil camps, right? They have certain areas of oil that they took away. They have some in Syria, some in Iraq. I would bomb the shit out of them. I would just bomb those suckers. And that's right. I'd blow up the pipes. I'd blow up the I'd blow up every single inch. There would be nothing left. And you know what? You'll get Exxon to come in there in 2 months. You ever see these guys, how good they are, the great oil companies? They'll rebuild that sucker brand new. It'll be beautiful. And I'd ring it, and I'd take the oil.
Now, wait a minute. If you're going to take the oil, why create more work for yourself by destroying the entire infrastructure? That makes no sense. Again, it shows that he is being contradictory in his terms. It shows that he is not really connected with reality, and this should cause a lot of concern for the decent, hardworking, red-blooded American citizens, because again, what we need to be focusing on is our national security. Not so much the ISIS oil money. We can handle that. We can handle that strategically, but we don't want to have it to where it harms the forces on the ground that would be in support of us. Again, it shows that he's not thinking. It's that sort of shooting at the mouth that Robert Gates brought up as a major point of contention with the mafioso quafioso. Because again, if he acts like that, if he is willing to say that, and keep in mind that he also said that he would be willing to bomb or go after the families of terrorists, irrespective of whether they were engaged in terrorism or not. It'd be one thing if they were, but to just go after the family, that would be ridiculous, because it would violate all of the Geneva Conventions and the laws of war and international law, and it would make a pariah out of the United States. And that's something that has concerned our national security personnel, something that really seems out of place, and it is out of place. It's something that is like what a child might say. And that's what I have to compare Trump to. When you listen to this sort of drivel, when you see that this is actually what he believes, or we're not entirely sure what he actually believes, but when he advocates this in front of the mainstream media, it creates this appearance of him being totally disconnected from reality. He comes off as nuttier than a nut bar. And that's because he is. He is just saying a certain thing to custom tailor a message for a particular audience in order to boost his popularity with that audience. That's what a politician does. It's certainly what a truly intellectually disingenuous politician does above all else. Yet we still hear from the rank and file of the Lion Branch Trumpidians as they pop their heads out of the Trumpidian tabernacle that somehow he is not a politician, that he is not doing the same thing that the politicians are. Well, okay, maybe he's not. He's even worse. He is the enabler of these politicians, the worst offenders of the rank and file of the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists. He's the one that has donated money over, what was it, over $100,000 to the Clinton Foundation that was used to impermissibly give certain foreign nationals a beneficial or cushy position because of their access to Hillary and because of donating to that foundation. And then there is this idea that he's just going to make everybody pay for everything else, such as what he said with NATO, and it's down the same line of thinking with, I'm going to build a wall and Mexico's going to pay for it. How is that going to come to fruition? Again, he doesn't provide any policy specifics, and there really is no way to provide specifics for that because there is no legal avenue by which he can force that of a sovereign nation. And with respect to NATO, it would be violating a treaty, something that the president can't do, not without the advice and consent of the Senate. But the way that the Senate is right now, if by some fluke or cruel twist of fate that he managed to win the general election slated for later this November, I'm not so sure that they wouldn't try and stop him from engaging in these sorts of things that would cause us to be enveloped in a war. And if we get enveloped in a major war, I don't know how we're going to pull through it. It's going to be very difficult to get us back onto the footing that's necessary to defend our interests. And if we're the aggressor, we're going to find ourselves without allies. And if we're without allies, that will literally leave us in an exceedingly dangerous position. But then turning back to how Russia is essentially saying that the United States is assisting ISIS by having unintentionally killed those 16 Syrian soldiers, that brings up the concerns with respect to Donald Trump's just bizarre connections with Russia. We've seen that he has this man crush on Russian strongman Vladimir Putin, and that his former campaign boss or bigwig there in Paul Manafort had some illicit connections with the pro-Russian Ukrainian government. And of course, the Ukraine is a major area of concern right now with what's going on in the Crimea. I don't think that Trump is going to be able to handle that because he's in cahoots with the main instigator or provocateur with respect to that just territorial grab, for lack of a better term. It's something that plays out like a comedy of errors, but it's even worse than that. It shows that Donald J. Trump is not thinking as a president or the chief executive for the United States of America would. He's thinking of it in the same way that he would with any one of his seedy business deals. It's all about greed. It's all about self-aggrandizement. It's all about pushing his self-interest come hell or high water. Damn the torpedoes, damn the consequences. But in this unstable world in which we live right now, where terrorism is clearly on the rise, where these attacks are threatening the sanctity and security of the United States, that just is not a gamble or risk that I think we can afford to take. The problem is that in this election cycle, and what makes it so depressing, is that we really have no one to turn to. There is no adequate source of strength for America. There's no one who is really grasping the foreign policy interests of the United States, at least to the extent that's necessary to return this nation to the path to prosperity, and that is just going to have these problems continue to balloon out. But the intellectually disingenuous position of the Lion Branch Trumpidians, who are still trying to convince us of this tyranny of false unity, that if we don't support Trump, we're somehow supporting Hillary. I don't get that. I just don't understand that. It doesn't make logical sense. And so then to say that this is what happens when somebody like Obama or Hillary is in office, I don't disagree with that. But to say that by refusing to support Trump that I'm somehow contributing to terrorism, that doesn't make sense. And it's almost as though they're going out and attempting to question our sense of patriotism, questioning our loyalty to the nation. Well, that's not something that they should do. You can be exceedingly patriotic, like Robert Gates is, and have these questions about the suitability and qualifications of the two candidates for the mainstay political parties. Because let's face it, the way that the system is right now, it will either be Hillary or Donald. But that does not mean that we must sacrifice our ability to vote our conscience. It does not mean that we need to bow down to the twisted machinations of either one of these candidates. Because if they do not represent your values, it goes to what John Quincy Adams, son of our second president and a former president himself, said, always vote your principle. Because though you may vote alone, you know at least that your vote is not wasted. Where has that sort of mentality gone? Why is that mindset not present in this current presidential election cycle? Well, a lot of the people are out there saying that it's because that was a different time. But no, he's speaking to one of those immutable aspects of the natural law, which is timeless. The ability for the American people to think and act for themselves is a necessary pillar of who we are, both as a nation and as a people. And if we lose sight of that, then we do expose ourselves to the sort of chicanery that is becoming a new norm in the American system of polity. That's something that I cannot tolerate. That is something that I'm sure that the vast majority of you, our cherished listening passengers and audience members, cannot tolerate either. So it comes down to a need for us to still support our nation, still have the ability to speak for ourselves, but we still have the right to voice our concerns. Because recall that one of the things that is safeguarded in the clear and concise language of the First Amendment to the United States Constitution is the right of the people to petition their government for a redress of grievances. That is a quintessential aspect of who we are. And what is being pushed forth as a sort of a claim of logic or logical argument, I think it's more of a fallacy that they're pushing, is that we just have to accept one or the other, and if we don't accept one or the other, then we are helping one or the other. That's just so convoluted. It makes absolutely no sense, but it speaks to the great danger that we are facing right now as I sit here and speak into this microphone. But again, the quality that matters to the American people is that ability to discern these things for themselves. That's why we have to pay attention. And no, it doesn't mean that we support one candidate or the other. As I've always said, my loyalty is to the only thing that I am called to swear allegiance to as a United States citizen, and that is our shared United States Constitution. There is nothing else. I want to basically begin wrapping up today's Solo Flight Special edition with focusing on that aspect of the political correctness that really is so dangerous with respect to the sorts of things that we're seeing with these terrorist attacks. And what I mean by that is, recall that in the immediate aftermath of both the San Bernardino terrorist shooting late last year and the Pulse gay nightclub shooting several months back, that the Democrats and their allies in the rank and file of the graduates of Pavlov School of Journalism for the salivating mainstream media went to immediately try and blame an inanimate object. They tried to go after the fundamental and inalienable God-given right of the citizens to keep and bear firearms, because they said that it wasn't terrorism, but it was the gun that did that. It's as though they are placing some sort of magical attributes to firearms that takes over the minds of people. Again, that just doesn't make sense. It's a childish approach, and it just is a form of obfuscation. They want to draw us out to basically be distracted from those real threats that are there. And part of the reason for that is they are in support of the collectivist mentality that ties into a lot of this Islamofascism. Because if you stop and think about it, fascism itself is a system that embraces a collectivist mentality. And that is so diametrically opposed to the natural law tenets that are contained within the clear and concise language of our shared United States Constitution. So what it comes down to is they don't want to take the harsh steps that are necessary that might challenge this propagandistic worldview that they have propagated for themselves and are trying to cram down the throats of the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, we the people, against our will. And again, it all ties into this idea that their twisted machinations cannot actually compete in a free marketplace of ideas. Rather, what they do is try and destroy anything that would be deemed a threat, anything that would challenge their primacy or their supremacy in the system of polity. Now, that is something that makes no sense whatsoever, because it is so out of line with the way that our founding fathers had intended and designed this system to work. Now, with respect to the alt-right, who are pushing for this sort of isolationism, which doesn't make sense, they try and point to some of the views of George Washington that we shouldn't get entangled in foreign affairs. Yes, in a way that is correct, but Washington was not opposed to protecting American interests. And if it meant having to go overseas to protect our interests, he and the other founding fathers were certainly ready, willing, and able to do so. Think back to the opening decade of the 19th century when Thomas Jefferson responded to the Barbary pirates off the coast of Tripoli, which is in Libya, by the way, by sending the Marines in. It's why in the Marine Corps hymn you hear "From the Shores of Tripoli." Well, that was the first engagement by United States Marines in a foreign affair. It was to protect our sailors who were being harassed by these Muslim pirates. And again, that's also at the time period when Thomas Jefferson began to have his own copy of the Quran, and he said that the Quran was essentially incompatible with our natural law tenets. Again, something that the historical revisionists who infiltrate our institutions of education from coast to coast and border to border don't want you to realize, because again, it goes against this politically correct diatribe that they have been foisting down our throats for decades now. And again, what it ties into is this overarching view that there is no right and wrong, and that the United States of America, being founded upon or based upon a philosophy, is accepting a system of morality which is inherently flawed. And again, the way they try to justify this is they tie it into this idea that, well, that's just outmoded thinking. It's outdated. It's antiquated. What's surprising about this election cycle that we haven't seen really come to fruition, at least in such a grand scale or at such a large impetus as it has in this election cycle, is that the alt-right is getting some sort of credibility or some sort of confirmation as to their views being within the norm and something that should be accepted, which is they too believe that the Constitution is antiquated and based on a notion that does not work. They think that the natural law tenets that all men are created equal, meaning that we have the ability to have equal opportunity, not equal outcomes, is inherently flawed. Why? Because again, they try and base their entire notion of identity off of skin color. At least certain factions of them do. I'm not certain that all those who espouse or claim to be a part of the alt-right believe this, but certainly the ones that have the most organized system or the most organized platform seem to go along these lines. And as I pointed out in a previous episode of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, in which I dealt with the ascension of the alt-right, I pointed to how their philosophers were fascist types, were those who went down the lines of the philosophy of Nietzsche of the Übermenschen, which is the Superman. This is a sort of thing that Adolf Hitler dabbled in, and what various other forms of white supremacist groups or other racial supremacist groups adhere to. And unfortunately, that ties into identity politics. And I'm sure many of you are puzzled as to why I'm bringing up identity politics when we're discussing these attacks in New York and New Jersey, in which we're not even sure whether they are terrorist based, but based on the circumstantial evidence, it certainly appears to be at least plausible that it could be related to terrorism. And identity politics plays right into that. It really does. It plays into it because the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists are going to go out on a limb to try and create any excuse that can pop up into their little heads to show that it's not this ideology, or that it's not based on a strain of Islam, and therefore it has to be something else. And that's when they start to go into the realm of absurdity. Again, pointing back to climate change causing it, or the fact that they are economically depressed, or that we, the big bad United States, have just trampled upon them in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. But again, it's all a bunch of rubbish. The fact of the matter is, there is this common denominator that has been there, and the greatest terrorist attacks that have been orchestrated have been carried out by Muslims. They weren't carried out by Coptic Christians. They weren't carried out by Catholics. They weren't carried out by the so-called abortion bombers. In fact, I haven't heard of an abortion clinic bombing in a very long time. And there's not the sort of infrastructure or logistical system with the so-called abortion clinic bombers that there have been with the Islamo-fascists. Remember that on 9/11, 15 years ago, we lost some 3,000 innocent American citizens. I've never heard of a Christian terrorist attack in the United States killing some 3,000 American citizens. I've never heard Christianity run out, or any part of Christendom run out and state that it's directly at war with the United States of America and our Western philosophy. That is something that is truly limited to Islam. That is what these frothing at the mouth Islamo-fascist barbarians are about. And again, it's that they want to create a caliphate. But when we stumble and try to just say that it's not terrorism or it's international terrorism, because if you recall back to what Bernie Sanders said in the first segment of today's program, he called it international terrorism, not Islamic terrorism, not even Islamic fundamentalism. And there are lingering questions as to whether that would just be considered Islamic fundamentalism. I don't know. I certainly don't think all Islam is that way, but there has been enough of it that it gives me reason to pause, and it would go against common sense to deny that that is a threat that needs to be considered. So we have to be practical in the way that we approach this. We have to see what the evidence shows, and when the evidence shows this undeniable pattern of a well-orchestrated and well-organized system that is going forth to attack the United States, to train people, and to encourage these sorts of destabilizing efforts on the part of either lone wolves or terrorist cells, that must be addressed. The problem is nobody is really addressing it, say for a few brave souls like Texas Senator Ted Cruz and Utah Senator Mike Lee and Nebraska Senator Ben Sasse. They understand that it's something that's greater than what is happening with respect to climate change, which is a joke, or that it's constitutionalists that are terrorists. No, constitutionalists are not terrorists. But recall that Salazar, the mayor of Austin, who was at some sort of convention with the Department of Homeland Security's Secretary Jay Johnson, he stood up and proposed that constitutionalists, those who adhere to the clear and concise language contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution, pose just as significant a threat to domestic terrorism and are domestic terrorists, and are just as dangerous as the Islamo-fascist terrorists. Again, when was the last time we saw a constitutionalist fly a plane into a building and annihilate 3,000 innocent American citizens, or 3,000 innocent citizens anywhere? We haven't, because it hasn't happened. That is the intellectually disingenuous drivel that these frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists engage in. And it's all done to essentially be a distraction. They want to have centralized power and control, and if they can essentially demonize anyone who would oppose their goals of incrementally pushing the United States of America towards that brink of the abyss of socialism, then they are going to take it. It's like what Cass Sunstein said: never let a tragedy go to waste. That's the dark and diabolical aspect of what the left does. They politicize every facet of their daily lives. If they are in, say, your parent-teacher association, they'll try and frame that in a progressive point of view. Or if they're in your local city council, they will carry that through. If they are in the board of governors of a private club, they will still try and politicize everything and try to push it from their point of view, come hell or high water. So in other words, it's as though they are incapable of divorcing themselves from their political narrative and agenda. But truth be told, it's more than just pushing forth a political narrative. And it's not that they are incapable, it's that they do not have the desire to break away from their agenda. That is radical. It's the same or similar sort of thinking that we see from the Islamo-fascist terrorists, in that they try to make everything based on their medieval approach to religion. They want everyone to be forced to submit to the will of Allah. And if you recall, what does Islam mean in traditional ancient Arabic? It means submission. It means to submit to the will of Allah. But we in the United States are, by the clear and concise language of the First Amendment, diametrically opposed to a Islamic theocracy, or an Islamic theocracy, because in the First Amendment it says that Congress shall make no law establishing a religion or inhibiting the free exercise thereof. So no, Congress cannot have a system in which there is an official church of the United States or an official mosque of the United States, but at the same time we can't just willy-nilly encroach upon the free exercise of religion. That means the ability to go out and worship as you see fit. But here's where the natural law tenets come in. When your faith is being practiced in such a way as to infringe upon the fundamental and inalienable God-given rights of your fellow individual popular sovereign, that is when it is not considered an exercise of religion. That is when it has jumped into something that is wholly on a different plane. So it's not that we are ignoring freedom of religion, it's that we are applying the actual way that the Constitution was interpreted to the incidents that are occurring and to these strains that are a threat. And that's why when Texas Senator Ted Cruz came forth and proposed this monitoring of say, Muslim neighborhoods or certain mosques, that really isn't violative of the First Amendment if the government can show a compelling reason under strict scrutiny as to why it's necessary. And when we have a slew of terrorist attacks, or when there is this undeniable pattern going all the way back to 1993, some 23 years worth of Islamo-fascist terrorism, then yes, that is a pressing governmental reason to limit that right in certain circumstances. But it's because the rights of other Americans are being threatened. Now, yes, there is still the avenue to challenge that in court. That's due process under the law. And no, we shouldn't get rid of that. That's why it needs to be a narrowly tailored sort of approach. And that's what Ted Cruz was offering or suggesting. Now, Trump, on the other hand, when he said that we need to ban all Islamic immigration into the United States, that would not be narrowly tailored. Now, it could be if it's to, say, state-sponsored terrorist nations such as Iran or Libya or Syria, that would be narrowly tailored, but again, it could still be open up to due process challenges in court. That's the way that our system was designed to work. That is the intrinsic and inherent part of our system of polity that's beautiful. It allows us to address the concerns that arise at a certain juncture in our history, but still giving great weight and importance to our civil liberties. We can't just walk away from that or act as though that delicate balancing act should be ignored, because it shouldn't just be ignored. It is something that must be addressed, and the best way to address it is in an even-handed fashion. But that brings up the concern of both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Hillary Clinton is not going to apply an even hand with it. We know that because of that way that she went out and tried to blame an anti-Muslim video for the Benghazi terrorist attack back in 9/11 of 2012. And she has been an advocate of the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftist approach to identity politics, which is essentially just something that they adopt to pit American citizen against American citizen with the tactic and strategy of divide and conquer. But on the flip side, with Donald Trump, it's the exact and polar opposite. We don't know what he's going to do. We know that he goes out and says brash, brazen, and bizarre things. We know that he has a history of being discriminatory. And I don't think that he has the working knowledge of the United States Constitution. In fact, I know he doesn't when he tries to call it a 12-article document to understand what strict scrutiny would entail and how to narrowly tailor something. But more so than that, who's to say that he wouldn't go out and just move forward with some, executive order or executive action, which he already said that he would do, that he would continue to use the pen and phone that Barack Hussein Obama has used to curtail the Constitution, to try and create this sort of caste system in America. These are dangerous, legitimate questions which I do not think have been addressed. And I think that that ties into the concerns of Robert Gates and others. If we are ever going to place this nation back onto the path of prosperity, it must be done so in a way that we are not abandoning those fundamental tenets that have propelled us to such lofty heights in our relatively brief yet illustrious history. That is one of the steps that I don't think we have seen seriously considered in this election cycle since the close of the primary process. So again, it's going to require that we, the people, in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty, ask ourselves, how do we approach this? If the government is going to refuse to identify Islamic radical terrorism as a major threat, then we must become more wary. We must become more vigilant. You see, that's what it entails when we say that this government is one that is created of delegated power and authority. We, the people, being the spring or the source from which all power and sovereignty and authority comes from in this country, have the power, the ability, and the responsibility to defend ourselves and to act in a lawful manner, but still act in a way to protect ourselves when the government refuses to act in its own capacity. And you know, national security is one of the few things for which there is an enumerated power to government. That's one of the things that they ought to do. It's just like border security is one of the powers that is explicitly enumerated under the legislative branch of government by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. But we see that the two candidates don't want to adhere or abide by that. In other words, they're going to continue to expand the power of the executive branch of government into a way that is holistically out of sync with the traditional powers that are enumerated unto the separate branches of government by the Constitution. And keep in mind that these separate branches of government, the separations of power, as it's known in our civics parlance here, was designed to ensure that no one singular branch of government could amass so much power as to be a major controller of the government. Centralized authority was something that our founding fathers inherently distrusted. But at the same time, they realized through the failings of the Articles of Confederation that there has to be some centralization. But it must be governed by a social contract. And of course, that social contract is our Constitution. So when we don't abide by it, and when we don't pay attention to its strict terms, that's when we start to see these problems come forth. And so we know that with respect to handling these terrorist issues, that's a national security issue. It's something that should be handled, but not in such a way as to infringe upon the rights of the general citizenry. Now, it may seem that I'm trying to engage in some sort of obfuscation here, or that I am splitting hairs with respect to it, but no, you have to be diligent, because it is we, the people, who are called upon to proactively maintain and safeguard our fundamental and inalienable rights. And when people like Jay Johnson and Salazar from Austin are so willing to just try and engage in this fanciful thinking that somehow constitutionalists and those who admire the Constitution are a greater threat, or just as great a threat to national security as Islamic terrorism, it shows that there is a strain of intellectual disingenuousness to it all that ties into being even deeper than what they refuse to do on the surface. What they refuse to do on the surface is to call it Islamic terrorism, or to place the blame where the blame rightfully deserves to be placed. That is playing a game of semantics. That is trying to tap dance around the issue so that they can continue to push their pet project and machinations of identity politics. But again, it's not something that coalesces with or lines up with our natural law tenets. And you see, that is what is so significant and what we must defend. So what happens in New York or New Jersey, we still aren't sure. We still, at this point, do not know exactly what motivated it. But if it turns out to be Islamic terrorism, I wonder how Bill de Blasio will respond to it. I've already got a sense that he'll just try and sweep it under the rug. He'll try to, again, turn to political correctness and moral relativism to try and say that we Americans ought to know better than trying to hold those who actually orchestrated this and carried this out accountable. We already know that after the San Bernardino terrorist attack, that that Loretta Lynch, the Attorney General, had come out and said that we had to protect our Muslim minority. It wasn't that she was concerned for the citizens or stopping these attacks from occurring. They were more concerned with this politically correct diatribe that they have been so dedicated to for decades now. And it's only getting worse. It shows no signs of improving at any time in the foreseeable future. So we have to, again, step back and make an assessment of this to determine just exactly how we are supposed to effectively respond to this. How are we going to go forth and ensure our own security? Well, as some of the commentators and pundits have been saying, be wary. Be alert and aware of what is going on in your surroundings. Don't go around failing to pay attention or placing yourself in a difficult situation. If you feel something is a threat, respond to it. Because recall that one of the things with Saeed Farouk's neighbor, who didn't like the odd and basically suspicious activities of all of those guys going into his garage, she didn't report him because she was afraid of being labeled a racist. Again, it's that type of politically correct drivel that has been pushed into the mainstay of the American system of polity that does a great disservice to us. It's a great disservice to us because it places us at significant risk when that risk is something that just shouldn't even be there. It shouldn't be something that we have to worry about, as it is not based in reality. But you see, again, they try and distort reality. They try to obfuscate the truth. And that's why we are dedicated to conveying the truth unto you. Now, with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back for one last round of alcohol. As always, folks, I'm your captain, Randy Wright, and I want to thank you for choosing to fly the Wright Flyer. I invite you to leave any comments, questions, or concerns you may have either here at our YouTube page or at our Facebook page or our Google Plus page. And on top of that, I invite you to follow us at Twitter with the Twitter handle at Radio Aviation EX. One more time, folks, that's at Radio Aviation EX. And there you will find the departure list that lists my personal Twitter account, the personal Twitter account of my first officer, Jeremy Grapenton, our Blogspot page, where we are putting up audio-only versions of our state-of-the-art radio program. And then there's the Cafe Press account. At the Cafe Press account, you can find all sorts of wonderful goods, watches, clocks, hats, shirts, maternity clothing, flip-flops, tote bags, laptop sleeves, phone protectors, all sorts of things at reasonable prices, either with our original logo on it or our first class passenger logo on it. With such a wide array of goods at reasonable prices, we're sure you can find something that'll fit in with you, and go ahead and take a look at that. And if you haven't subscribed, please go ahead and do so that you are kept abreast of everything that we are bringing to the forefront. Thank you again, folks, for flying the Wright Flyer. We'll see you again next time. Do take care.